He dismissed her with 3 words. She dismantled his empire with 1 keystroke. Welcome to Ruthless Romance Tales, where power wears lipstick and vengeance wears Louboutins. Hit that subscribe button, because the woman in red is about to teach a king that thrones burn when you underestimate the match. The boardroom stretched like a cathedral of glass and steel. 47 floors above Manhattan, where the air tasted of ambition and old money. Kang Dae-hyun sat at the head of the table, spine straight, jaw carved from the same stone as his reputation. His black suit fit him like armor, every thread a declaration that he owned the room, the building, the very oxygen his executives breathed. Around him, 12 men in identical expressions of practiced deference shuffled papers that would legitimize $500 million in holdings his family had built on blood and silence. This merger wasn't just business, it was baptism. The moment the Kang family stepped from shadow into blinding, legal light, Nix Calder stood near the corner, a slash of crimson against the neutral palette of frightened men. Her red blazer was bold, unapologetic, tailored to her frame with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Beneath it, her skin gleamed like polished mahogany, her cheekbones high and sharp enough to cut through the suffocating politeness that filled the room. Her lips, painted the color of wine and warning, remained neutral as she watched the proceedings with dark eyes that missed nothing. She'd been introduced as a compliance auditor, a last-minute addition from the acquiring firm, someone to rubber stamp the contracts and disappear into the footnotes of corporate history. That's what they thought. That's what he thought. She waited until the final contract slid across the table toward Dae-hyun's Montblanc pen before she spoke. Her voice was silk over steel, calm as still water before the drowning. Section 14 has a problem. The room froze. 12 executives stopped breathing. Dae-hyun's hand hovered over the pen, then retreated slowly, his gaze lifting to find her. For 3 seconds, he studied her like she was a stain on his perfectly orchestrated moment. Then his expression shifted into something worse than anger. Dismissal. Complete, total erasure of her relevance. Miss Calder, he said, each syllable precise and cutting. Your job is to observe, not interrupt. I suggest you remember which one pays your salary. Nix didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her pulse remained steady, a metronome of control while every man in the room tensed, waiting for her to crumble under the weight of his authority. She simply tilted her head, the motion almost curious, and continued as though he hadn't spoken. The holding company structure in Section 14 exposes 17 shell accounts directly traceable to your family's primary channels. The moment this merger goes public, federal auditors will have a roadmap straight to your laundering networks. You'll be signing your own indictment. The silence that followed was different, sharper. It had teeth. Dae-hyun's jaw tightened, the only crack in his composure. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, and gestured toward the door with 2 fingers. Security materialized from the shadows like well-trained dogs. Escort Miss Calder out. Clearly she's confused about her purpose here. She should have argued, should have protested, should have done what any rational person would do when facing humiliation in a room full of witnesses. Instead, Nix reached into her blazer pocket, extracted her phone with movements so unhurried they bordered on theatrical, and typed something with her thumb. 1 command, 4 seconds. Then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made the temperature in the room drop 5 degrees. I didn't say the flaw was accidental, Mr. Kang. She dropped the phone back into her pocket, smoothed her blazer, and met his gaze with eyes that held galaxies of secrets he'd never see coming. I said it was fatal. She walked toward the door, heels clicking against marble like a countdown. The security guards parted, uncertain whether they should still be touching her. Dae-hyun watched her go, his brain already dismissing her as a footnote, an irritation, a woman who'd overstepped and paid the price for her audacity. He picked up the pen, signed the first page. The second. By the third, his phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then erupted into a symphony of notifications that turned every head in the room. His chief financial officer went pale, staring at his own screen like it had just shown him footage of his own funeral. Sir, the accounts, the primary accounts, they're locked. All of them. Dae-hyun's hand stopped mid-signature. Outside the glass walls, beyond the sterile perfection of the boardroom, the woman in red stepped into the elevator. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She'd already set his world on fire, and she had a front-row seat to watch it burn from 47 floors below, where the ashes would eventually fall. He'd treated her like furniture. He should have treated her like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. 24 hours. That's how long it took for Kang Dae-hyun to realize he wasn't just losing money, he was being hunted. The first sign came at 3 a.m., when his head of security burst into his penthouse, face slick with sweat, to inform him that the building's access codes had been changed. Not hacked, changed. Every digital lock, every elevator override, every panic room protocol now answered to someone else. The second sign arrived 6 minutes later, when his private banker called from Geneva, voice cracking with the kind of fear that only came from watching 9 figures vanish into encrypted voids that didn't legally exist. But it wasn't just frozen, it was restructured. Holdings moved into shell companies he didn't recognize. Shares redistributed through offshore entities with names that meant nothing. His lawyers would need weeks to untangle it. If they could untangle it at all. The third sign was the bullet. It shattered the floor-to-ceiling window of his bedroom at 3:47 a.m., missing his head by inches, embedding itself in the Italian marble behind him with a sound like a tooth breaking. Dae-hyun hit the floor on instinct, his heart a war drum against his ribs, glass raining down like poisoned snow. The night air rushed in through the wound in his sanctuary, carrying with it the distant wail of the city and something worse, the certainty that whoever fired that shot knew exactly where he'd be sleeping. His security team flooded the room within seconds, weapons drawn, shouting coordinates and protocols that suddenly felt as useful as prayers to deaf gods. But Dae-hyun wasn't listening to them. His mind was racing backward, replaying the last 24 hours like a film reel. He'd missed every critical detail of the first time. The accounts weren't just frozen, they were bleeding. Every hour, another subsidiary went dark, another offshore holding dissolved into digital smoke. His lawyers couldn't access the files. His accountants couldn't trace the commands. It was as though his entire financial infrastructure had been replaced with a ghost version of itself identical on the surface, hollow and dying underneath. And then came the messages. Not to him, to his enemies. The triad received an anonymous tip at 11 p.m. last night, his location, his security details shift changes, the blind spots in his building's camera coverage. Someone had gift-wrapped him and left him on his rival's doorstep with a bow made of breadcrumbs. This wasn't corporate sabotage. This was an execution, dressed up in code and cryptocurrency. He crawled toward his desk, ignoring the shouts of his security team trying to drag him to the reinforced safe room, and yanked open his laptop with shaking hands. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the personnel file for Nix Calder, the woman in red, who'd walked out of his boardroom like she owned the exit. The screen loaded. His stomach dropped into a void that had no bottom. The file was blank. Not incomplete. Blank. No employment history, no background check, no education records, no former addresses, no social security number that matched any living person in any database his people had access to. Even her photo was a stock image, traced back to a royalty-free website in Estonia. Nix Calder didn't exist. She'd never existed. She was a ghost wearing flesh, a phantom who'd walked into his life, smiled at him with those wine-dark lips, and then erased him from the world with the same casual ease most people used to delete spam. System architect. The term floated up from the darker corners of his memory, whispered about in rooms where men like him talked about people they couldn't touch. Ghosts for hire. Digital assassins who didn't kill with bullets, they killed with information, with access, with the ability to make you disappear without ever leaving a body behind. They were myths. Urban legends. The kind of thing you didn't believe in until you were already dead. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it, pulse thundering in his ears, before answering. "Hello, Mr. Kang." Her voice poured through the speaker like honey laced with cyanide, that same unshakable calm that had filled the boardroom yesterday. "I trust you've had an eventful evening." His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "Call them off." "Call who off?" Amusement danced in her tone, light and terrible. "I'm just a compliance auditor, remember? I don't have the authority to call anyone." Another window exploded, this time in the living room. His security screamed coordinates. Dae-hyun didn't move. He kept his eyes on the screen, on the empty file where a woman should have been, and felt something shift in his chest, rage and something darker. Something that tasted like fascination. "What do you want?" The line went quiet. He could hear her breathing, soft and steady, while his world shattered around him in real time. When she spoke again, her voice dropped lower, intimate as a blade pressed to his throat. "I want you to understand something, Dae-hyun. You don't dismiss me. You don't gesture me out of rooms like I'm staff. And you certainly don't sign documents I tell you are poisoned. She paused. "The triad will be at your building in 11 minutes. I suggest you run." The call ended. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. He had 11 minutes to find the only person who could stop the bleeding, the woman he'd thrown away. Chicago smelled like rain and rust, the kind of cold that sank into bones and stayed there. Chicago wasn't random. Nix had 3 safe houses scattered across 2 continents, but Chicago was the one Dae-hyun would find. She'd made sure of it left just enough digital breadcrumbs for a man of his resources to follow. Because if he didn't come after her, if he didn't care enough to hunt her down after everything she'd done, then she'd misjudged him completely. And Nix Calder never misjudged anyone. Dae-hyun found her loft in the West Loop, 3 floors above a gastropub that pretended to be dive bar, hidden behind a door that didn't match the neighborhood's carefully cultivated grit. He'd tracked her through 5 shell companies, 2 dead-end addresses, and a trail of digital breadcrumbs she'd left like a dare. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had kissed his skin, drawing a line of fire across his collarbone. Blood had soaked through his shirt, now dried and stiff against his ribs. He'd bypassed her security in 4 minutes child's play compared to what she'd done to his empire. The door gave way with barely a sound. She was waiting for him. Nick sat in an oversized leather chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of red wine balanced between fingers that looked too delicate to dismantle kingdoms. The city sprawled behind her like a constellation of broken promises, lights blurring through the rain-streaked glass. She wore black now silk that moved like water against her skin. No armor of crimson to announce her presence. She didn't need it here. This was her cathedral, her war room. She glanced up when he entered, gun raised and trembling with adrenaline, and smiled like she'd been expecting him for tea. "You found me faster than I anticipated," she said, swirling the wine in lazy circles. "I'm impressed. Fix it." His voice came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep in his chest where rage and desperation had tangled into a knot he couldn't untie. "Fix what you did, or I paint these walls with you." Nix took a slow sip, her dark eyes never leaving his over the rim of the glass. When she lowered it, her lips glistened like fresh wounds. "Shoot me, Dae-hyun, and the encryption key dies with me. Every account, every holding, every piece of your legacy locked away forever." She set the glass down on the side table with a soft click. "You're already a dead man walking. I'm just the one deciding if you get a funeral." His finger tightened on the trigger. He wanted to, God, some primal part of him wanted to watch her expression change, wanted to see that infuriating calm crack open and spill fear. But his hand wouldn't obey. Because she was right. She'd always been right. "You leaked my location to the triad. You tried to have me killed." "No." She rose from the chair with movements that belonged to dancers or predators, something graceful and lethal. "I exposed the person who's been trying to have you killed for the last 6 months. Your lieutenant, Park Min-sok. The one you trust with your supply chains, your shipment schedules, your offshore accounts." She moved toward a desk in the corner, extracting a tablet with fingers that knew exactly where everything lived. "He's the one who contacted the triad. He's the one who embedded the flaws in your merger documents. I just made sure you'd see them before you signed your own death warrant." She turned the screen toward him. Financial records, encrypted messages, timestamps that painted a portrait of betrayal so complete it stole the air from his lungs. Park's communications with triad leadership, agreements to split Dae-hyun's territory after his convenient disappearance, payments already transferred for services not yet rendered. The hit wasn't about the merger. It was about a coup dressed up as corporate warfare. "You're lying." But even as he said it, he knew she wasn't. Every piece fit too perfectly, explained too many inconsistencies he'd been ignoring for months. "I don't lie, Dae-hyun. I don't need to." She set the tablet down, stepping closer until the gun between them felt less like a weapon and more like a excuse for the distance he desperately needed. "I just show people the truth they've been too blind to see." Something snapped. He closed the space between them in 2 strides, pressing her back against the exposed brick wall with his forearm across her collarbones, the gun forgotten at his side. He could feel her pulse under his skin, steady as a metronome, could smell the wine on her breath mixed with something darker, sandalwood and secrets. Her eyes held his, unflinching, and in them he saw his own reflection. A man undone, unmade, standing at the edge of a cliff he hadn't known existed until she'd pushed him toward it. "You destroyed everything." His voice came out quieter than he intended, rough with emotions he couldn't name. I saved your life." Her words were a whisper against his mouth, so close he could taste them. "You just hate that you needed saving." He should have stepped back, should have demanded answers, solutions, anything logical. Instead, he pressed closer, feeling the rise and fall of her breath against his chest, the way her body didn't yield but didn't fight either. She was heat and danger, and everything he'd been taught to destroy before it destroyed him. But she wasn't afraid. She'd never been afraid of him, and that was more intoxicating than any victory he'd ever claimed. Why? The question scraped out of him. Why expose him now? Her hand came up, fingers trailing along his jaw with a touch that felt like a verdict. "Because I don't work for people who disrespect competence, and because watching you burn would have been a waste." The glass didn't shatter this time, it simply disappeared. One moment the loft windows were intact, reflecting their silhouettes against the storm-dark city, and the next they were gone, replaced by the howl of wind and the unmistakable sound of rope sliding through tactical harnesses. The triad wasn't knocking. They were descending from the roof like angels of a very specific, very permanent reckoning. Daehyun's training kicked in before conscious thought could catch up. He spun toward the first figure dropping through the window frame, gun rising, but Nyx's hand shot out and caught his wrist with a grip that shocked him with its strength. "Don't," she hissed, already moving. "Gunfire draws more of them. There are 4 men with automatic weapons about to fill this room." 6 men, 2 more in the stairwell. She was already at her desk, fingers flying across a keyboard with the kind of speed that looked like muscle memory encoded into bone. "And shooting won't save us, but darkness will." The lights died. Every bulb, every screen, every digital clock, the entire loft plunged into absolute black just as the first operative's boots hit the hardwood. Daehyun heard confusion in the sudden shuffle of movement. The sharp commands barked in Cantonese, but Nyx was already pulling him toward the kitchen. Her hand in his was steady, certain, like she'd walked this path blind 1,000 times. Maybe she had. Maybe she'd planned for this exact scenario the moment she'd rented the place. "The fire suppression system," she whispered against his ear, her breath hot in the freezing darkness. "In 30 seconds, this place becomes hell. What are you—" The sprinklers erupted. But not with water. Steam. Scalding, billowing clouds of it that filled the space like fog conjured from nightmares, reducing visibility to nothing and turning the air into a sauna that made breathing feel like drowning. The operative started shouting, disoriented, and Nyx pulled Daehyun down behind the kitchen island just as the first burst of gunfire lit up the steam like lightning in storm clouds. They were shooting blind now, panicked, at shadows that didn't exist. "You hacked the building maintenance system," Daehyun said, something like awe bleeding into his voice despite the situation. "I hacked it 3 months ago when I rented this place. I prepare for contingencies." She was moving again, staying low, pulling him with her toward what he thought was the back wall. "You survive by being smarter, not louder." They reached the service door, one he hadn't even noticed when he'd broken in, and she had it open in seconds, ushering him through into a narrow maintenance corridor that reeked of concrete and old pipes. Behind them, the operatives were still shouting, still firing into steam and emptiness. Ahead, the corridor stretched into darkness, punctuated by emergency lighting that barely qualified as illumination. "The stairwell's compromised," she said, already running. Her heels were gone now, discarded somewhere in the chaos, and she moved like liquid shadow in bare feet. "We take the service elevator to the parking garage." They hit the elevator just as the door to the stairwell burst open behind them. 2 more operatives, these ones not blinded by steam, raising weapons with the kind of intent that left no room for negotiation. Daehyun slammed the elevator button, grabbed Nyx, and pulled her against him as bullets sparked off the metal doors sliding shut. The impact threw them against the back wall, her body pressed to his, both of them breathing hard in the sudden, horrible quiet of descent. "Your car's in the garage?" she asked, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against his chest. "Black sedan, north corner. Won't work, they'll have tagged it. Tracking device. Maybe a bomb if they're thorough." She pushed away from him, straightening her silk shirt like they hadn't just escaped death by inches. "We go on foot." "On foot? Nyx, there's a bounty on my head the size of a small country's GDP. "I know. I'm the one who calculated it." The elevator doors opened to the parking garage, all shadows and concrete pillars. Rain hammered the entrance ramp, turning the city beyond into a watercolor of neon and dark. She grabbed his hand again, lacing her fingers through his with an intimacy that felt more dangerous than any weapon. "Stay close. Don't let go. And for God's sake, stop thinking like a man who's used to winning. Right now, you're prey. Act like it." They ran into the rain, leaving the sedan behind, and Dae-hyun heard the explosion before he saw it, a fireball that lit up the garage in shades of orange and red, exactly where his car had been parked. She'd known, and she'd saved him again. This woman who'd dismantled his life with a keystroke and was now keeping him alive with nothing but brilliance and audacity. The Chicago night swallowed them whole, rain soaking through their clothes, turning them into ghosts running from ghosts. Somewhere behind them, the hunters were regrouping. Somewhere ahead, the city sprawled infinite and indifferent. And between those two certainties, Dae-hyun realized he'd never felt more alive than he did, running through the dark with her hand in his, both of them marked for death and refusing to die. The motel was the kind of place people went to disappear or die, whichever came first. Peeling wallpaper the color of nicotine stains. Carpets that had seen decades of sins they'd never confess. A single bed that sagged in the middle like a broken promise. The neon sign outside flickered red through the rain-streaked window, casting everything in shades of warning. Dae-hyun sat on the edge of that bed, soaked to the bone, blood seeping fresh through his shirt, where the wound had reopened during their run through 6 miles of back alleys and abandoned rail yards. His hands shook as he peeled the fabric away from his shoulder, revealing the angry line the bullet had carved across his collarbone. Nix locked the door behind them, engaged both deadbolts, and wedged a chair under the handle with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Her silk shirt clung to her like a second skin, rain-darkened and ruined, outlining every curve and plane of her body in ways that made concentration impossible. Her hair had come loose from its severe style, now falling in wet spirals around her face, softening features that had been all sharp edges and control. She looked human now, dangerously, devastatingly human. "Let me see it," she said, moving toward him with bare feet that left wet prints on the stained carpet. "I can handle it." He reached for the first aid kit she'd lifted from the motel's maintenance closet, but his fingers fumbled the latch, trembling too hard to find purchase. She knelt between his legs, taking the kit from him with hands that didn't shake at all. "Your hands are trembling." "Not from fear." His voice came out rougher than he intended, his gaze dropping to her mouth, those lips that had smiled at him while his world burned, that had whispered truths he hadn't wanted to hear. "From adrenaline, from running, from wanting to strangle me or kiss me, and not being sure which one wins." She opened the kit, extracting a needle and thread, antiseptic, gauze. Her fingers were steady as surgeon's tools as she poured alcohol over the wound without warning. He hissed through his teeth, jaw clenching, but didn't pull away. "You're trying to decide if I'm your savior or your executioner. Maybe you're both." He watched her thread the needle, those elegant fingers performing a task that should have looked out of place but somehow didn't. She'd done this before too. Stitched wounds in grimy rooms, far from hospitals that asked questions. "Maybe that's what terrifies me." She pressed the needle to his skin, and he realized in that moment he trusted her completely, this woman who'd destroyed his empire, who'd led assassins to his door, who held his life in her hands with nothing but surgical thread and steady conviction. The first stitch pierced clean, and he didn't flinch. He watched her face instead, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her tongue touched her upper lip when she focused. "You're not a CEO," she murmured, working the thread through with practiced efficiency. "Not really. You wear suits like armor, sign contracts like declarations of war. But underneath?" She glanced up, meeting his eyes, and something in her gaze shifted. "You're a warrior playing at civilization. I should have seen it sooner. And you're not an auditor." Each word came out between stitches, his shoulder burning with the good kind of pain, the kind that meant healing, meant survival. "You're an architect of chaos. You build empires and burn them down before anyone realizes you were holding the match." "Guilty." She tied off the final stitch, cutting the thread with her teeth in a gesture so intimate it stole his breath. Her hands lingered on his shoulder, fingers tracing the edges of the bandage she applied with care that felt like tenderness. "But I don't burn everything. Some things I keep." "Why save me?" The question had been building since the loft, since the moment she'd pulled him through darkness and steam. "Why not let the triad finish what you started?" Nick sat back on her heels, still kneeling between his thighs, her dark eyes holding secrets he'd spend lifetimes trying to decode. "Because Park is the real enemy. He's been bleeding your organization dry, setting you up to take the fall for his ambitions." I don't punish people for being dismissed. I punish people for being disloyal." She paused, something dangerous flickering across her expression. "And because watching you grovel has a certain appeal." "Grovel?" His laugh was sharp, incredulous. "You want me to beg?" "I want you to understand your position." She rose to her feet, towering over him in bare feet and ruined silk, every inch a queen in a kingdom built from ashes. "I can unlock your accounts, restore your access, hand you back your empire on a silver platter. But first, you give me Park. And you ask nicely." He should have been furious, should have thrown her off, reclaimed his dominance, reminded her who he was before she'd taken everything. Instead, he stood slowly, his body crowding hers, until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The air between them crackled with electricity, with tension that had been building since that boardroom, since the moment she'd smiled and set his world on fire. "Please," he whispered, the word foreign on his tongue, tasting of copper and surrender. "Help me destroy the man who betrayed me." Her smile was slow, wicked, triumphant. "There, was that so hard?" "Yes." He caught her face between his hands, thumbs tracing her cheekbones, feeling her pulse jump beneath his touch. Every word was agony. "Good." She leaned into him, her breath mingling with his. "Now do it again." He kissed her instead, crashed his mouth against hers with all the pent-up fury and desperate need that had been clawing at his ribs since Chicago. She tasted like rain and revenge, like whiskey they hadn't drunk and blood he'd spilled. Her hands fisted in his wet shirt, pulling him closer even as she bit his lower lip hard enough to sting. This wasn't gentle. This was war declared in the space between heartbeats, a claiming that had nothing to do with tenderness and everything to do with two predators recognizing their match. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the motel room felt smaller, hotter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. "Tomorrow," she whispered against his mouth, pulling him down onto the bed with her, her fingers already working the buttons of his ruined shirt. "Tomorrow we hunt, but tonight I finish restructuring your empire. You'll get everything back, just slightly reorganized." He was too focused on her mouth, on the heat of her skin against his, to ask what reorganized meant. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, they had survived, and survival tasted like her lips and felt like her hands pulling him closer, like the promise that some things were worth more than empires. The neon sign outside flickered red through the window, painting them in shades of warning and promise, and neither of them looked away. The motel Wi-Fi was a joke barely functional, passworded with the kind of creativity that suggested someone's birthday circa 1987. Nix cracked it in 43 seconds. By the time dawn broke gray and unforgiving through the window, she'd built a digital trail that would lead Park Min-sok exactly where she wanted him. The abandoned pier on the south side where shipping containers went to rust and men went to settle scores that couldn't be settled in boardrooms. Daehyun watched her work from the bed, still shirtless, his freshly stitched shoulder a reminder of how quickly power could bleed out when you weren't watching. She sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop balanced on her thighs, fingers dancing across keys with a rhythm that looked like music. Her silk shirt had dried stiff against her skin, and she'd buttoned it wrong one button off, creating an asymmetry that somehow made her look more dangerous, not less. Like she'd dressed in the dark after burning someone's life down. "He'll know it's a trap," Daehyun said, his voice still rough from too little sleep and too much of her taste still on his tongue. "Of course he'll know." She didn't look up, didn't break her focus, "but he'll come anyway, because I'm dangling something he wants more than your death." She hit a final key with emphasis, then closed the laptop with a soft click. "Me." The word hung in the air like a blade. Daehyun sat up straighter, ignoring the pull of the stitches. "Explain. Park didn't just betray you for money or territory. He betrayed you because he needs a system architect to legitimize his takeover, to clean the money, to make him invisible in all the ways that matter." She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something in her eyes that looked like vulnerability. "He's been hunting me for 2 years. The boardroom wasn't random. He planted me there, thinking I'd signed on to work for him. When I exposed his trap instead, I became the prize he couldn't afford to lose. So we're giving you to him." The words tasted like ash, like betrayal, like everything he'd spent his life fighting against. "No." She stood, moving toward him with that liquid grace that never faltered. "You're walking in there unarmed, playing the desperate king willing to negotiate. and I'm going to be in your ear the entire time, making sure you don't die doing it. The pier smelled like dead fish and diesel fuel, a graveyard of Chicago's industrial past where the city stopped pretending to be civilized. Dae-hyun stood in the center of it, the wind off the lake cutting through his jacket, no weapon in his hands because Nix had insisted. "He needs to believe you're vulnerable," she'd whispered, while fitting the nearly invisible earpiece. "He needs to think he's won." Now her voice was a constant presence in his head, intimate as breath. "He's approaching from the north. 2 men with him. Stay calm." Park Min-sok emerged from behind a shipping container like a ghost given flesh, his suit immaculate despite the surroundings, his smile the practiced kind that had fooled Dae-hyun for 3 years. Handsome in the way knives were handsome, all clean lines and hidden purpose. His guards flanked him, weapons visible but not raised. Yet, the guard Dae-hyun had shot the one he'd deliberately aimed for the shoulder instead of the heart, watched him with eyes that understood mercy when they saw it. "Dae-hyun." Park's voice carried false warmth. "You look terrible. Rough few days? Cut the performance, Park. You wanted this meeting. Here I am." Dae-hyun kept his hands visible, non-threatening, every muscle in his body screaming to attack while Nix's voice in his ear kept him grounded. "Tell me what it takes to end this." "End this?" Park laughed, the sound genuine and cruel. "You still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation. This is an execution that's been 3 years in the making. I've been bleeding your organization dry since the day you promoted me. Every account, every deal, every rival who mysteriously knew your movements, that was me, building my empire inside yours, waiting for the right moment to step out of your shadow." "He's stalling," Nix whispered. "He's waiting for something. Stay focused." "So what do you want?" Dae-hyun asked, forcing his voice steady. "My head on a platter? My territory? Name it." "I want her." Park's expression shifted, hunger replacing the theatrical contempt. The woman in red who walked into that boardroom and proved she could dismantle kingdoms with a keystroke. Nix called her. Or whatever she's calling herself this week. "I know she's with you. I know she's been keeping you alive." He took a step closer, hands in his pockets, casual as a man ordering coffee. "Give her to me, and you can have your empire back. Your accounts, your territory, your precious reputation. All of it, intact." Dae-hyun felt his heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that felt like war drums. "She's not property to be traded." "No," Park agreed, his smile widening. "She's much more valuable than property. She's the key to every locked door in the criminal underworld. With her skills, I don't just take over your organization, I take over everything. The Triad, the Bratva, the cartels, everyone who's ever thought they were untouchable." He pulled one hand from his pocket, holding up a phone. "I have recordings of every conversation you've had with her for the past 72 hours. Every plan, every admission, every felony you've committed together. It's set to auto-upload to federal authorities if I don't check in every 12 hours. Give her to me, and the recordings disappear. Walk away, and you both go to prison. I keep the empire, and you rot in a cell watching her do the same. Dae-hyun." Nix's voice cracked in his ear, tight with something that sounded like fear. Real fear. "Don't you dare." Park watched him, waiting, reading every micro-expression like a book he'd studied. "Think about it. Your legacy, or one woman who'll disappear the moment something shinier catches her attention. System architects don't have loyalty, they have contracts, and hers with you is about to expire." The wind off the lake howled between the containers, carrying the smell of rust and rain and choices that couldn't be unmade. Dae-hyun looked at Park, the man he'd trusted, the brother he'd chosen, and realized he was looking at a stranger. Had always been looking at a stranger. "No," he said quietly. Simply, the word carrying more weight than any throne. Park's expression went cold. Flat. The smile dying like a light switched off. "Wrong answer." He raised the phone. "Then the recordings upload in 10 seconds. Hope you enjoy prison food." What happened next moved like choreography written in violence and desperation. Park's finger moved toward the upload button, and Dae-hyun lunged. Not gracefully. Not with the calculated precision of a man who'd been trained since childhood to fight. He moved like something feral, something that had finally remembered it had teeth. His fist connected with Park's jaw before the guards could process the movement, sending the phone skittering across wet concrete. The guards raised their weapons, but Nix's voice exploded in his ear. "The gun. Northwest container. Red handle. 3 seconds. Dae-hyun didn't question. He dove, rolled, came up with the weapon she'd somehow planted there before he'd even arrived. The guard he'd spared, the one who'd felt the difference between a man who killed because he could and a man who killed only when he must made his choice. He aimed at Park instead of Dae-hyun. The second guard froze, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, choosing the latter by dropping his weapon and running. Park was already moving, scrambling toward the phone, but Dae-hyun was faster. He kicked it away, pressed the gun to Park's temple, and for 3 perfect seconds, everything was simple. Pull the trigger, end the betrayal, reclaim what had been stolen. Don't. Park's voice wasn't pleading. It was calm, terrifyingly calm. You think the recordings are on that phone? They're on a server, encrypted, set to upload automatically unless I input a code every 12 hours. Kill me, and you'll never get that code. You'll both be in federal custody by sunset. He's bluffing, Nix whispered in his ear, but there was something underneath the words, something that sounded like uncertainty. Dae-hyun, he has to be bluffing. Am I? Park tilted his head, the movement slight despite the gun. Want to test that theory? Want to bet her freedom on your instincts about a man who's been lying to you for 3 years? Even if you torture me, I'll die before I give you that code. And the moment I flatline, the upload triggers automatically. So here's the choice. Shoot me, and watch her go to prison. Or lower the weapon, walk away, and I'll let her live free. You lose everything, your empire, your dignity, your revenge, but she gets to breathe. Seems like a fair trade for a woman you've known 3 days. Dae-hyun's hand trembled. Not from weakness, from the sheer force of will it took not to pull the trigger anyway, not to end this and damn the consequences. Every cell in his body screamed for Park's blood, for justice delivered in gunpowder and finality. But then he thought about Nix in that motel room, cross-legged on stained carpet, building traps from Wi-Fi and Audacity. Thought about her hands steady on a needle, stitching him back together while his shook. Thought about the taste of her mouth, rain and revenge, and something that felt dangerously close to salvation. Dae-hyun. Her voice cracked, actually cracked. Don't you dare give him anything. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words meant only for her. The gun clattered to the concrete. The sound of it hitting the ground was the loudest thing in the world, louder than his heartbeat, louder than Park's laugh, louder than the voice in his ear screaming his name. Dae-hyun straightened slowly, hands rising in surrender, every muscle in his body locked in place to keep from doing what every instinct demanded. There we go. Park stood, brushing dirt from his suit, reaching for the phone with a smile that promised suffering. That's the difference between us, Dae-hyun. I would have pulled the trigger. I would have chosen power over sentiment every single time. That's why I'm going to win, and you're going to die forgotten. He picked up the gun, turning it over in his free hand. And the girl? She'll work for me. Eventually. Everyone has a breaking point. I'll just have to find hers. Dae-hyun, listen to me. Nix's voice was steady now, cold and focused in a way that made his spine straighten despite everything. The recordings. I've been scanning frequencies, tracking data packets since the moment he mentioned them. The server he's talking about? I found it. I'm in. I need 60 more seconds to wipe everything. Or maybe she can't crack it. Park aimed the gun at Dae-hyun's chest, casual as pointing out directions. Maybe I'm better at this than she thinks. Maybe you just made the wrong choice. His finger moved to the trigger. Goodbye, old friend. Thanks for the empire. Now, Nix screamed. Dae-hyun, now. The loyal guard, the one who'd been spared, fired. The bullet took Park in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, and the phone flew from his hand. It hit the concrete, screen cracking, and Park screamed in pain and fury. Dae-hyun dove for his fallen weapon, came up with it raised, and pressed it against Park's forehead. The code, he said quietly. Give me the code to stop the upload. Park laughed, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. There is no code. There never was. The recordings were a bluff, you idiot. I deleted them an hour ago because I knew she'd find them eventually. I just needed you desperate enough to... Got it. Nix interrupted through the earpiece, her voice breaking with relief. All recordings deleted. Server wiped. Backup drives corrupted. He's got nothing. He never had anything. Silence pressed down like a physical weight. Park's eyes went wide, the realization hitting him harder than the bullet. His entire plan, his leverage, his perfect trap, all of it built on lies that Nix had just confirmed were exactly that. Lies. Dae-hyun lowered the gun slowly, stepping back, and looked at Park with something that might have been pity if it had been directed at anyone else. You made a mistake, he said quietly. You thought I valued power more than people. You thought wrong. Park laughed, bitter and broken. So what now? You execute me on a dock like some kind of movie villain? Very original. No. Dae-hyun pulled out his phone, made one call. His people arrived in 6 minutes not to kill Park, but to disappear him. A private medical facility in the countryside where doctors asked no questions and patients had no visitors. Park would live. He'd heal, but he'd never see daylight again. He'd spend the rest of his life in a comfortable prison, watching through newspapers and television as Dae-hyun rebuilt everything he'd tried to steal. That's the difference between us, Park, Dae-hyun said as they loaded him into the van. You wanted me dead. I just want you erased. As the van doors closed on Park's screaming protests, Dae-hyun pressed his fingers to the earpiece and said the words that mattered most. I'm coming home. Hurry, she whispered back, and he could hear the smile in her voice. I'm waiting. Dae-hyun didn't remember the drive back to the motel, didn't remember commandeering the loyal guard's car, didn't remember the streets blurring past in shades of gray and urgent need. He only remembered her voice in his ear, steady, alive, real, guiding him through turns and traffic lights like a lifeline he couldn't afford to drop. His hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache. The gun discarded in the passenger seat, Park's fate sealed and distant. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except getting back to her. The motel door was already open when he arrived, kicked in from the inside, hanging crooked on its hinges. His heart stopped. Started. Stopped again. He took the stairs 3 at a time, burst into the room with adrenaline still singing through his veins, and found her standing by the window. Laptop packed, bag slung over her shoulder, eyes wide when she saw him. Alive, whole, beautiful in that ruined silk shirt and bare feet, her hair still wild from everything they'd survived. You're okay. The words came out broken, barely sound. You're okay. I told you I'd wipe the recordings. But her voice shook, betraying the fear she'd been holding at bay while he'd been standing on that dock with a gun to his head. I told you I'd handle it. You couldn't have known he was bluffing about the upload trigger. He crossed the room in 2 strides, catching her face between his hands, needing to touch her, to confirm she was real and breathing and not a ghost his desperate mind had conjured. He could have been telling the truth. I could have gotten you arrested, imprisoned. But you didn't. Her hands came up to cover his, her fingers trembling against his wrists. And you dropped your gun anyway. You surrendered. For me. Of course I did. The confession tore out of him, raw and unfiltered. What else was I supposed to do? Let you go to prison to keep my pride intact? Let him destroy you so I could feel like a king? He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in rain and smoke, and something underneath that was purely her. I have nothing if I don't have you. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize every line, every scar, every truth he'd never spoken aloud before. You risked everything. Your empire, your reputation, your revenge. All of it. I'd do it again. His thumb traced her cheekbone, the elegant line of her jaw. I'd do it 1,000 times. I'd burn the whole world down if it meant keeping you breathing. Something shifted in her expression, a wall crumbling, a defense falling. She'd spent her entire life being untouchable, being the ghost who moved through the world leaving no trace, trusting no one because trust was a liability she couldn't afford. But here, in this grimy motel room that smelled like desperation and new beginnings, she let herself be seen, let herself be vulnerable in a way that scared her more than any threat or danger ever could. I've never had anyone choose me, she whispered. Not over power, not over anything that mattered. Then you've been surrounded by fools. He kissed her forehead, her temple, the corner of her mouth, soft touches that felt nothing like the aggressive claiming from before. This was different. This was reverence. You're the most dangerous thing I've ever encountered, and I'd rather have you on my side than against me. But more than that, he pulled back, making sure she could see the truth in his eyes. I'd rather have you, period. Empire or no empire, king or no king. As long as I have you, I have everything. She kissed him then, and it was nothing like the first time. That had been fury and desire tangled into something combustible. This was surrender, recognition. 2 people who'd spent their lives alone finally understanding they didn't have to be. Her hands fisted in his jacket, pulling him closer, and he lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her the 3 steps to the bed that had become their sanctuary. They fell together onto sheets that smelled like cheap detergent and survival. and for once neither of them was thinking about strategy or escape routes, or the enemies still circling in the dark. They were just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage, who'd chosen each other over everything else that was supposed to matter. His hands tangled in her hair, her fingers traced the stitches on his shoulder with a tenderness that made his chest ache, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw his future reflected back, dangerous and beautiful and absolutely certain. "Stay with me," he murmured against her lips, between kisses that tasted like promises. "Not just tonight, not just until this is over. Stay. I'm a ghost, Daehyun. I don't stay anywhere." But even as she said it, her arms tightened around him, holding on like she had no intention of ever letting go. "I disappear. It's what I do. Then haunt me." His mouth traced down her throat, feeling her pulse flutter beneath his lips. "Haunt me for the rest of my life. Be the ghost I can't escape. The one I don't want to." She laughed, the sound breaking into something that might have been a sob, might have been relief. "You have no idea what you're asking for. I'm asking for you, all of you, the brilliant, terrifying, impossible woman who dismantled my world and then saved my life." He pulled back, catching her gaze, making sure she understood this wasn't just adrenaline or proximity, or the desperate need for connection after staring down death. "I'm asking you to build something with me, something that's ours." Her hand came up to cup his face, thumb brushing across his lower lip with a touch that felt like an answer. "Okay," she whispered, "okay." And then there were no more words, just the two of them in a room that had witnessed 1,000 endings, writing their own beginning in the language of touch and breath, and the kind of trust that couldn't be bought or stolen, only earned, only given freely by two people who'd finally found someone worth surrendering to. The neon sign outside flickered red through the window, painting them in shades of warning and promise, and neither of them looked away. Seoul in winter was all sharp edges and cold ambition, a city that never apologized for what it wanted or how it took it. 2 months had passed since the pier, since the motel, since the moment Daehyun had learned that some things were worth more than crowns. The Kang building rose 73 floors above the Han River, glass and steel that caught the morning light like a blade, and inside its walls, everyone walked softer now, spoke quieter, looked over their shoulders. Daehyun had returned from Chicago different, harder. The board members who'd grown comfortable in his absence found themselves facing a man who no longer played by rules that weren't his own. 3 executives had been replaced in the first week. 5 more resigned before they could be pushed. The merger that Park had tried to poison, Daehyun had restructured it entirely, turned it into something that tripled their holdings, and left their competitors scrambling to understand how he'd pulled victory from ashes. The whispers in the hallways said he'd made a deal with the devil. They weren't entirely wrong. He strode through the executive floor that morning with purpose in every step, his suit tailored to perfection, his expression carved from the same stone as his reputation. Assistants scattered from his path. Conference rooms fell silent when he passed. He'd become the thing everyone feared, a king who'd learned that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Park was alive, rotting in a private facility where doctors kept him breathing but not whole, a living reminder of what happened to traitors. The triad had backed off after a carefully orchestrated demonstration of what Knicks could do with their financial records. The empire was his again, stronger, more ruthless, unshakable. He pushed open the door to his office, already mentally cataloging the meetings scheduled for the day, the deals that needed closing, the territories that required his attention. But the words died in his throat. Nix sat in his chair, not perched on the edge like a visitor, not standing behind it like someone waiting to brief him. She sat in his chair, the throne he'd spent 3 years bleeding for, with one leg crossed over the other, wearing a white suit that looked like armor made of light. Her hair was pulled back in that severe style he remembered from the boardroom. Her lips painted the color of warnings nobody heeded. She looked like power personified, like a queen who'd finally claimed her castle. "Good morning, Mr. Kang." Her voice was silk and steel, that same unshakable calm that had first destroyed him and then saved him. "We need to discuss your company's financial structure." He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden stillness. "That's my chair." "Is it?" She swiveled slightly, the movement lazy, predatory, because according to the documents I've been reviewing, 51% of this company's shares are held by a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a corporation that happens to be solely owned by me. She tilted her head, studying him with eyes that held galaxies of secrets. "Which technically makes you my employee. Didn't anyone explain the fine print when I restored your accounts?" The world tilted, righted itself, tilted again. Dae-hyun stood frozen 3 feet from his own desk correction, her desk processing words that should have filled him with rage, should have triggered every instinct to take back what was his, to fight, to reclaim the throne she'd somehow stolen while he wasn't looking. Instead, he felt something else entirely. Something that tasted like admiration and desire, and the dangerous thrill of finally meeting someone who played the game better than he did. You've been planning this. Not a question. A realization that was somehow both devastating and exhilarating. I've been planning this since the moment you dismissed me in that boardroom. She stood slowly, rounding the desk with movements that belonged to conquerors. You thought I was there to audit compliance. I was there to audit you, to see if you were worth saving, if you were worth keeping. She stopped inches from him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something dark and expensive that hadn't been there in the motel. Turns out, you are, but on my terms. He should have been furious, should have felt emasculated, diminished, reduced to something less than what he'd fought to become. Instead, he felt liberated, free from the weight of pretending he had to be the strongest person in every room, because here, standing in front of him in white armor and victory, was someone stronger, someone smarter, someone who'd looked at his empire and decided it was worth her attention. So what now? His voice came out rougher than intended. You dissolve everything I've built? Sell it off piece by piece? Turn me into a figurehead? No. She reached up, straightening his tie with fingers that lingered just a moment too long against his chest. Now we build something better. Together. You're the face, the force, the king everyone fears. And I'm the mind behind the throne, the ghost who makes sure we're always 3 moves ahead. Her hand flattened against his heart, feeling it thunder beneath expensive fabric. We're partners, Dae-hyun. Equals. Except when it comes to the paperwork. Then I own you. He caught her wrist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. And you think I'm just going to accept that? Let you claim everything I've bled for? I think you already have. Her free hand traced the line of his jaw, the touch possessive and tender all at once. I think you accepted it the moment you dropped your gun on that pier, the moment you chose me over your pride. That was your first surrender. This is just making it official. He spun her around, pressing her back against the desk, his desk, her desk, their desk, and watched something spark in her eyes. Challenge, invitation, the promise of a partnership that would burn brighter than anything either of them could build alone. I serve at the pleasure of the queen, he murmured against her lips, the words both submission and seduction. Then serve, she whispered back, and pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like empire and forever. Outside the office windows, souls spread beneath them like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. And inside, 2 predators who'd finally found their match began planning their next move. Together, he thought he was the boss. He was just the muscle. She was the mind. And if you want to see who they destroy next, who they build up, who they become when 2 unstoppable forces decide to move in the same direction, hit that subscribe button and join the Ruthless Romance Tales family. Because this is just the beginning. Every week, we bring you dark romance that doesn't apologize, passion that doesn't play safe, and love stories where power meets its match. Don't miss what happens when these 2 set their sights on the world. Subscribe now, and let's burn it all down together. We'll see you in the next chapter.